a very good morning, or good day, or good afternoon and evening, wherever you join from. I'm your facilitator and co-host for today, Konstantin Weicht. I'm from Vienna, Austria, but based here on the east coast of Taiwan at Tzu Chi Buddhist University. And I'm thrilled to facilitate this session 11. We have as our special guest Nicola Robbins, and she will be talking about crossing the threshold, divination, uncertainty, and decision making in entangled systems. This is part of the 2026 MSR Research Colloquium, the mystical and research dwelling at the threshold of knowing. And across the colloquium, we gather as a global community of scholars and practitioners to explore how mystical experience may be embodied, researched, taught, and also brought into leadership, management, and organizational life. And what better topic than crossing the threshold, divination, uncertainty, and decision-making in entangled systems. Our speaker today has an MS in industrial ecology from Yale University, the School of Environment, and a BSc from the University of Cape Town in environmental impact assessment. That also explains why early on in her career she was a sustainability manager for Nissan, but then she moved on and is the co-founder and partner at Insight, based at Cape Town, South Africa. In her work, she draws on cross-cultural scientific traditions to help organizations navigate uncertainty. She's a senior associate at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership and a visiting lecturer at the UCT Graduate School of Business and Trinity College, Dublin. Her background also spans the natural sciences, African economic history, with professional training in impact assessment, anthropocomplexity, and Ngoma practice. And I did practice the pronunciation of that term. I hope I got it right.
Yeah, good.
Good. So what can you expect? This session explores how threshold practices can improve decision-making in organizations. So think about questions like, how do we bring the wisdom of Ngoma divination to the management community? How can we do this effectively and with respect? And can it help us to navigate uncertainty? I think especially in these times, a lot of uncertainties, and we need to look for new and innovative ways to approach this uncertainty. Let me just, before we kick off, or before I hand over to you, introduce our tech support. That is Daniel Nitschka today. So if you experience any technical issues, then please just reach out to him in the chat. Nicola also said she's happy to receive questions during the presentation, so just raise your hand or put a question in the chat, and I will facilitate that. There will also be an embodied practice towards the end of the session, and depending how the session goes, we either have the questions during the talk or then at the end. So maybe one last thing. Nicola told me there's a storm where she is. We hope everything will be all right. And the storm doesn't cross the threshold, stays where it is. Yeah, so I think we will be fine. So Nicola, thank you very much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to this session. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Konstantin, and thank you all for joining. It's wonderful to be here. So I greet you all, and I greet your ancestors that stand behind you, all the way back to the beginning of time. I also acknowledge the knowledge systems that you bring from many traditions that are here present in some way in the room. So thank you for being here and for being with them. And I also have a thanks to say to MSR because I'm really more of a practitioner than a researcher. So thank you for your openness and for your inclusion. It's really good to be here. I am going to share my screen, so hopefully this will come out. Please tell me if it isn't going to come out. Are we good? Thanks, Sonia.
Yes, we can see it.
Thank you so much. So this is indeed crossing the threshold, and what we're going to cover, I'm hoping, unless we get waylaid, but I'll try not to get waylaid, is pretty much this. I'll give you a little bit of an introduction. We'll start with a bit of entanglement, because that's always a good place to start. And then I'll give you a little background on the Ngoma tradition. I'm not assuming many people have much knowledge. A few people on the call will have a fair amount of knowledge. Then I will touch on what I learned from this tradition about thresholds, and then dive into a particular aspect of Ngoma, which is divination as a threshold practice. I will get into what it might mean for management, and that's going to really look at my own practice as a consultant in organizations. I'm still a sustainability consultant, Constantine, so I went back there. And the reason I went back is because the whole idea of Ngoma and Ngoma training is you don't go away from your community. You get the training to take it back to the community, because the community is where the bigger problem lies. It's less individual than it is social. And then if you're up for it towards the end, we'll do a short practice, which is about readiness to cross thresholds. Okay, and ask questions. I will be short in my answers to the questions you ask during the session so that we can keep some time at the end. So let's look at entangled systems and the Ngoma tradition. So I was born in Cape Town, and this is the beginning of entanglement. My ancestors came to Cape Town from Cornwall in Great Britain. It was the late 1800s. What had just happened was gold and diamonds had been found on the Witwatersrand, and the British Empire was expanding its colonies. And so it was moving out, finding resources, and then finding a way to get them back to Britain. And my great-grandfather came to South Africa just after gold and diamonds had been found. He wasn't a miner, he was a stonemason. And what they wanted to do was build essentially a colonial university in order to train the geologists and the mine managers to facilitate the extraction of African resources for the British Empire. Here we have the beginnings of what is inevitably going to be an entanglement, which is how I came to grow up under apartheid in South Africa. This was roughly from the 60s, formalized, but obviously before that it was rife. And from the 60s onwards, it was a time of extraordinary repression and violence. So I was born in the late 60s, and I was obviously, being a white person, was not the target of that violence and oppression. But human bodies can feel it, no matter whether we're the target or not. The body can feel it, especially if we're children. We take it on. Even if we grow up in a liberal household, as I did, there's a kind of a inherent lie that goes on with many liberal realities, which is that it doesn't go very deep below the surface. Anti-apartheid, yes, but however, not quite open to the kind of depth of analysis that is needed to really take it apart. So this was, again, entanglement, even if for me at the age of a sort of young age, it wasn't conscious. And so as the body takes it on, as a child, right, we don't process it necessarily. But in Ngoma traditions and in many indigenous traditions, those things that we take on, and we can in some ways call them spirits, they are there and they can wake up. The violence of the past can return. And strangely enough, I had no idea this was going to happen. It happened to me when I was consulting as a sustainability consultant to Argyle Diamond Mine in the Kimberley region, diamonds, right? Western Australia. This was in November 1999. And I was walking across the mine. I just arrived in order to do the audit. And I was walking with the mine manager, and he was telling me about their business process reengineering. And I suddenly heard another voice. And the voice said, "This land is sacred. Nothing can justify what's being done to the earth." Now, I was a scientist. I'm still a scientist. I'm very identified with Western science. And in fact, it was so impossible. What had happened, what I'd heard was so impossible that, as minds can do, I literally forgot it immediately. And that would have been it, except that my body didn't forget. Something had crossed a threshold somewhere, and I got back to Cape Town, and the panic attacks began, shaking, rashes. It got worse and worse as the months went on. I was in psychotherapy. It wasn't really helping very much, although, in a way it was useful to have someone to talk to. But essentially, the only solution was very heavy antidepressants and potentially antipsychotics. And my body said, no, that's not going to work. Eventually, I had what was probably called, in psychological terms, synesthesia. It's when the mind starts mixing up its signals. So in my case, it was that auditory signals became visual signals. I could be in a business meeting, and this is what really kind of pushed me to the edge of the threshold I was prepared to venture into. Essentially, in a business meeting, I knew the chair was talking, but the sound was dulled, and what I could see was lights that were coming and bouncing off against the wall, which sounds kind of funny, but it's not funny when you're in a business meeting and you don't know if they're talking to you. You also don't know, what's being said. And I suddenly realized at that point, and really this was a threshold for me, that I was in a position that I could absolutely not control. Because if I could not trust my body, I could not manage whatever this was. And that is how I came to end up training as an Ngoma diviner in Botswana. This is the local indigenous tradition, and the training itself is the cure for what they call affliction with spirits, or what we call affliction with spirits. The training is indigenous to Africa broadly. It's not strictly indigenous to Southern Africa. It is traveled down with people from West and Central and Eastern Africa, actually. And so this is where I trained. It was a very intensive 24/7 training. It lasted for 4 months. So it's quite an intense immersion in both humility and training. And it worked. I was more than healed after that. It was amazing. And this is a tradition, obviously, to which I owe a great debt. And I want to add one thing more about Ngoma. The word itself means song, drum, or ritual. It's a collectivist system. So as I suggested earlier, the healing, yes, it is addressed to me as an individual, but it is intended to ripple through the individual and into the social context that gave rise to the sickness in the first place. In other words, the sickness was a social one. And this is a quote from Harriet Ngobani, who is a sort of eminent early anthropologist in this space. She writes, in Ngoma, illness is not merely individual or biological, but symbolic of wider social imbalance. And so the cure itself becomes a way to ripple into, in my case, the business world, right? Because that was my community. It's a rural African cure at that time, but it was now needing to be returned to the community that gave rise to the sickness. And that's really what I want to share with you today. Okay, I'm going to jump into part 2, unless there are any questions on that part. Okay, brilliant. So what did I learn about thresholds from Ngoma? Well, in Ngoma training, that's me 25 years ago. In Ngoma training, student diviners mark each crossing symbolically and physically, literally, by kneeling, by clapping an acknowledgement. So if it's a doorway, a greeting an elder, entry into wilderness, we're going to greet the spirits who dwell at whatever threshold is there. And this grounds us in reality. It shows respect. And in the beginning, it's kind of fun, right? Because you're suddenly in a whole new space. You have a new name, you have a new identity, everything is new. But after a while, it becomes very tiresome because the student is always under pressure. This is not a casual retreat into training. It's not kind of what we would understand from a usual training space. It's highly disciplined, almost militaristic in a way. Time is tight, instructions are never ending. The student's constantly told what to do. Obedience is non-negotiable. This is the nature of what you consent to when you enter into the training. And after a couple of weeks, kneeling at a threshold is physically painful. The body is racked from dancing for hours in mediumistic trance, right? So you're channeling ancestors, it's a trance space, and you dance for a very long time every day. The knees are a complete mess because you're kneeling every time you engage. A lot of the time you're walking on your knees. Your feet, because you walk on those too, are full of thorns and small stones, and it's hard to get them out. So thresholds become real. It is embodied really in the experience of feeling the pain and doing it anyway. And for me, the idea was that thresholds are actually about discipline in the face of things that draw us away from what the moment or presence requires. They're profoundly about attention. They're not about like, a sort of trip out and have a nice liminal. I mean, they can be, but in this system, in this context, they're not. They're about attention. And sort of later on, when I reflected on thresholds, I came to this idea, I suppose, because, this is sort of a more academic for me, because the Ngoma training is it's a-conceptual. There are absolutely no questions. You don't ask questions. You just do. And it's purposely structured like that because it's trying to get away from that mind trying to engage with stuff. So a threshold for me became not a thing, not the doorway, not even a zone, but more a relationship between things, between, in many cases, two different states, rather than marking the edge of one or other. It's where you don't have anything to hold on. It's not this or that. It's kind of both. And in some ways, we experience threshold more like a sliding scale. This working with this ability to move between two things. And it's a trained capacity. This is trained quite intensively in the Ngoma system. We notice where we are on the scale of the threshold, and then we use what you could probably call micro movements, little experiments to amplify what's working and dampen what isn't. Because what we're looking for in this threshold is a balance in which possibility expands. Something other becomes possible. We don't know what it is, but something other, which kind of opens us to something more than we had before. So that's a very murky explanation, but it's as good as I can kind of do. I will give you some examples now when we jump into Ngoma divination as a threshold practice. Okay, again, I'm taking a slight breather in case there are any further questions, and we can get into them later. You're good, Konstantin. So this is kind of the meat of the Ngoma stuff for me. And as I said, I'm diving into divination as one practice. They have other practices. They do a lot of medicines, plant medicines. We do a lot of dancing and singing. There is also a lot of ritual, and obviously working with spirits is very kind of core to this. But I'm going to look at divination as the key threshold practice. And as an example of this kind of exploration. So the other thing about thresholds, and divination is a good example, is that there are many. There's not just one threshold. There are many nested thresholds. They're operating simultaneously. So threshold, in many respects, becomes an organizing principle. And so we can think fractal if we like. Because they're operating in a similar pattern, the sliding scale, but at different levels of granularity. So this is my example of Ngoma divination. There you'll see my friend Goro Komari. He is an Ngoma diviner. This was taken earlier this year in Ramotswa village in Botswana. And what he is doing is there are about 5 or 6 people around him. He has thrown those bones, and the bones are shells, and there's some bones and they're carvings, and there you'll find a dice in there, you'll find a coin. It's stuff, right? It's objects. And what he's done is he's shaken them up, he has honored the ancestors, and he's thrown the bones down onto this red mat. And everyone is sitting around and they've got a question that they're asking that they don't know the answer to. And what he's doing with them is he is looking at what those objects represent. Because while we know they sort of represent some things, that representation can be quite fluid. And he's particularly looking at the relationship between them. So between one object that might mean home and another object that might mean danger. Yeah. So he's looking at the relationship between those things. And he is telling a story. He's voicing a story that other people are contributing to in various ways at the same time. That's what he's doing. So there's thresholds there. The first threshold is who's in and who's out, because people will sit together and they will divine, but there'll be some people who don't want to be part of the divination and they'll stand a little bit back and they'll watch it. And so there's a threshold there of how involved you get into it. So the ritual itself, are you in or out of the container? People are always able to join if they want to, but they don't have to. A second threshold that is operating is around identity. And that's particularly the identity of the diviner, because Gogo Khamare is a medium. He's channeling the particular ancestral spirit that he uses to do divining. And so he is managing that sliding scale between himself and the ancestral spirit. He's not totally the spirit, but he's not totally himself either. So it's an identity threshold. The third level of threshold, in many respects, are those divinatory objects themselves, what we call the bones, although they're not just bones. They have a particular meaning that has emerged over time, but that meaning is quite fluid. And so something can mean mother, it can mean motherhood, it can be your mother or my mother, it can be earth and earth mothers. Right? It can be so many aspects of what that is. And he's cycling between the fluid meanings to create a more dynamic and inclusive understanding of what is going on. And then finally, and we could probably go on, but finally, the other threshold I think that's really interesting for this session is the threshold between intuition, that embodied sense of, it's this, right? And the analytical knowing, which sits back and takes a little bit of distance and perhaps holds hypotheses and tests them and sees whether in fact that is true, understands what patterns are we seeing and experiencing from the past. And so you have these thresholds of movements between things, scale, a sliding scale, allowing for complexity, allowing for uncertainty as the story unfolds. And that's quite hard if we are part of a modernity. And Ngoma, incidentally, it's not a hunter-gatherer. It's not a First Nations culture. It is a modern culture in the sense that people who are of Ngoma culture, they are accumulating a surplus. They are agricultural, agropastoral, and they accumulate wealth in the form of cattle. And this goes back about 4,000 years, only 4,000, not sort of tens of thousands of years, as most First Nations do. And so they're grappling with how do we manage this modernity that allows us to create, effectively, they were creating even to the scale of empire, right, at this stage. I mean, we had African empires rising and falling at this stage. So they were aware that people who were trying to help manage this complex unfolding of modernity, of having to, grow bigger villages and do mining and to do agriculture and to run trade networks with China and with India, because all this was going on 1,000 years ago in Africa, way before colonialism. This was the training that Ngoma diviners went into. And it's training the threshold of mind. The word is umfihlo, an Ngoma word, Zulu word, and it means the science of hidden things, the science of hidden things. And this is a process where people are trained to divine. They enter a light trance, they auto-induce a light trance. What that does, it enhances intuition. And there's neuroscience if you want the Western stuff, but I'm not too worried about that. But it just is. So a light trance will enhance your intuition. You become more aware of things in your body. Memories pop up that you might not have been thinking about, top of mind. In that light trance, the teacher tells the student to find what's been hidden. Now, the teacher has hidden something from the student. Often it's something the student did wrong, okay? But sometimes, for example, it's an object, it can be a thought, it can be anything. In other words, the possibility space of what is hidden is great. The student drops to her knees. Now she's in a light trance. So intuition is happening. And now she has to use an analytical method, not just intuition, an analytical method to cut the possibility space because it's too broad just for intuition. She uses what we call in data science a binomial tree search. That's what the kind of Western word for the similar analysis approach is. And what she's doing is she's saying what you've hidden is made by God, for example. That might be the first hypothesis. And the teacher will bang on the drum and say, 1 bang is no, 2 bangs is yes. But the teacher goes 1 bang, no. Now the student already knows that what is hidden is in the realm of what humans make, not natural, what humans make. And she'll ask another question. The questions are coming out of intuition, but the question itself is an analytical method in terms of splitting the possibility space. So she says, it is bigger than my hand. No, says the teacher, 1 bang on the drum. Now she knows this is a small thing. That little bit of extra information reminds her that when she was doing her beading this morning or last week, she dropped a bead, right? It rolled into a crack. She didn't have time to fetch it, but her body remembered. She says to her teacher, it's a bead. Bang on the drum. Bang, bang, 2 bangs, it means yes, it's right. And now she knows what it is. She can tell him the color of that bead. And then she needs to tell him where he's hidden it. And where he's hidden it could be anywhere, but she slowly over time develops the ability to work out the way he likes to hide. And so her intuition gets cued from understanding the homestead, understanding more about her teacher. And within a few weeks, students rapidly improve their ability to find what is hidden from view with a little bit of feedback. And I have a question on there, so please go ahead. Or is that me pushing my own hand up?
Yes, you put your own hand up.
I didn't put the hand up. I didn't touch it. Okay, I'm obviously asking myself a question. I don't know how to put that down. Did I do that?
I put it down for you.
Oh, please put it down for me. That's really strange. Oh, you know why? It was because I put up my hand to say it's bigger than my hand. Yeah, that's what it was. Sorry about that. Okay, so that is the process of Umfihlo. And so in this process, the intuition is generating the hypotheses. She's just saying them so fast. She's not thinking. She's just saying hypotheses very rapidly. The teacher is generating the feedback. In a deeply embodied space, the student is learning to combine intuition and analysis. But when she graduates as a diviner, the feedback will come from the community. The feedback will come from the ancestors, her ancestors and other ancestors. The feedback will come from the land, from nature, from what is happening beyond the divination space. And that's why traditional divination is a social, even an ecological act. It's not a one-to-one transaction. That's what it's become now in sort of modern capitalistic terms. That's how diviners make money, right? Which is very understandable. But traditionally, it's a collective intelligence that is at work here. And the diviner is learning to connect into and evoke, in many respects, that space for collective knowing. Of course, this was very cool, right? But we have to know what this means for management, because we've got to realize that in my case, as I said, I'm not a rural African. I have to find ways of working this in my own community. Otherwise, what's the point? The sickness comes in many respects from my own community. And so the question arose, can it help us to navigate uncertainty? Can it help me do sustainability work better? And it might sound obvious now in many respects, while there's this interest in Indigenous knowledge, and I think it's more well known, and we're getting to understand a little bit more about it. despite centuries of erasure. But it wasn't obvious to me. It was really difficult to bring this back to the boardroom. And this is really, for me, a huge threshold. Because, yes, I can throw the bones on the boardroom table, right? But it's unlikely to land as a method that really impacts decision-making and strategy. And that's because people sitting around a table in the boardroom have already got in their minds a space where divination fits, right? They've kind of put it into a little box which says, oh, this is interesting. Oh, this is lovely. Oh, this is very African and this is nice, And unfortunately, it's very rare that a methodology or a method or a practice like this can get out of that box of what we might call edutainment, right? A performative, an interesting African way to open our meeting, where the meeting is going to actually be about something else informed by other ways of knowing entirely. Very often, if I go in, or if we go in and we're doing traditional things, it becomes more about us as the consultant than about the decisions themselves. In other words, almost a sort of an egoic opportunity to market how different we are, perhaps. And that doesn't honor Indigenous traditions at all. It doesn't honor the wisdom of Indigenous people. In fact, what it does is it rips it out of context. It takes it away from something that is deeply embodied, deeply understood, and deeply part of a whole network of relationships and understandings, which is never going to make it into the boardroom. So how do we do it? How do we bring this knowledge, this wisdom back effectively? So in a way that genuinely gives something novel to the business context, that challenges it in effect, but also with respect to the communities that have developed this over millennia and who are still trying to manage the erasure that has taken place as a result of colonialism. Here's how I eventually did it. I called this, I called it co-attentional space. Co-attentional space. And I use it all the time now as a sustainability consultant. I mainly work with large corporations, but basically any organization. We know that for those of us who are involved in sustainability transition, and I know at least one person who is on this call, it's complex. Sustainability challenges like climate, like poverty, they're entangled with each other. They're uncertain. You pull one string and another hole opens somewhere else. There's generally no one right answer. And a lot of people in this space, certainly business people, become overwhelmed by that cognitive load. It's so complex. People will tend to turn to experts and often external consultants. Now that gives me a job. But at the same time, it's precisely the wrong move if you're an organization. And that's because in complexity, better decisions require nuance. They require local contextual knowledge. Better decisions don't come in a best practice manual. Those are decisions that take place in an ordered world where what happened before will reasonably happen next. They're predictable. That's not complex. Complex is different to that. Knowledge in complex systems is embodied in the diverse perspectives of those who form part of the system. And that's not the consultant, no matter how desirous she may be to do something useful. And that's why divination works as a social technology, right? It's all about the people in the village, not the diviner. And this idea was eventually the method I called co-attentional space. You don't need to know it's linked to divination. Sometimes it's better that way, but it is. What happens with co-attentional space? Well, when people enter co-attention together, what they bring to the table expands. Co-attention evokes intuition, memory, things that they didn't know they knew, implicit knowledge, if you like. At that point, because more knowledge is going to come into the room, stuff you didn't anticipate, that wasn't in the best practice manual, possibility increases. Things that were implicit now become speakable. And that's the kind of local intelligence that matters in uncertainty. Ngoma, we would say we access the energy of what's called isivalo. It's known as the resonator. The resonator is when people begin to resonate together. You'll know this feeling because everyone has had it. It's the most natural human thing. We don't have time for it often in business. But resonance happens when your intuition begins to catalyze mine. Your analysis begins to support a deeper understanding for me. It's a collective space of resonance. In organizations, we might say we move from meeting as information exchange to meeting as genuine collective sense-making. We cross a modern threshold. The difference is not necessarily explicit or obvious. I don't stand there and announce, now we're going to do co-attentional space. we just do it, and I'll show you how now. But everyone feels it, you know, whether they're sensitive or not, they feel it. And the backstory, that's the picture of my book, by the way. This is where that's the story of how I came to find this method eventually. Okay, this is the little bit recipe. Of course, there's no recipe. So I'm going to give you a nice linear 5-step process, which isn't always nice and linear. But what I've tried to do here is just show the little steps that are in the back of my mind to give rise to or to catalyze this co-attentional space. Is somebody asking a question? No, yes, no. Okay, thanks, Konstantin. And just to say, number 1, 2, 4, and 5 come from the words, those words, respect, connect, etc., come from Tyson Yunkaporta's book, Sand Talk, and he credits Mama Doris Shillingsworth, who's an Aboriginal elder. So this kind of goes back to my time at Argyle Diamonds, which kicked this all off. But the first step is respect. We see ourselves in each other. We acknowledge who's in the room, possibly ancestors, maybe the more than human world. It's not an imposition. We don't sort of force this onto teams that don't want it. We fit in with them, timing-wise. This is a deeply human thing. Anyone who's interested probably in management and spirituality and religion doesn't need to be told this, but it's how I open things if I'm talking about divination or indigenous knowledge. The second thing we do is we connect. This is a sliding scale. We diminish intention and we expand attention. So this is not an intentional space, it's an attentional space. And the difference becomes obvious as we move into the unexpected. I don't announce this, but one of the ways I do it, there are many ways to connect into this sort of embodied intelligence. One of the ways I do it is I name what's called 3 fault lines. So fault is not anyone at fault. Fault lines is the geological term. We're talking about the terrain here. We're talking about what happens when an imposed structure, and this is a linear ordered structure, like a profit formula or a supply chain, meets a living system like life. So when you have an organization, you're going to try and organize things and make them ordered so that you can manage the profit formula. You're invariably going to impose that on a living system, which is complex, which isn't ordered, which has different patterns, but not a predictable order. What happens is things start to crack underneath that, and we override it. We don't look at the tensions. We don't look at the fragilities until they hit us in the face, right? And a mountain speaks to us in Australia. But everyone knows in an embodied sense that all is not well all the time. Everyone knows that there are problems in how they do things. And that allows them to recognize these possible fault lines, these possible patterns, and their stories will follow. They'll start telling you stories about how it happened in their life. And that's when we begin the process of co-attention. I can't anticipate what those stories are. All I've done is allow the fault lines to catalyze them. I've named them. And then everyone goes into paying attention to what the stories carry. The stories are what is important. People sometimes don't share them. They think, oh, but this is not important. You know, what we're doing is important. No, the stories are what we're doing. So we're noticing what's present, what's missing. We're noticing hints of emerging pattern in the stories. We're not analyzing. This is just collective tracking. And then at step 4, everyone sits with what's surfacing. What does this mean for us? These stories that have arrived, what does it mean for the task, for the team? We're not trying to conclude. Again, we're in that space of reflection. And towards the end, we would move into direction. Let's let the meaning find its action. Small, pragmatic steps that enable learning. No grand plan, no big, hairy, audacious goals, right? None of these big strategies when you can predict the future and it's going to be zero carbon because that's what we want. No, we cannot know in our context whether this is right. We just do the next right step. The next right step. What can we do as a group of people? And so, as I said, there are many ways to do it. This is the way of fault lines, which is naming little patterns, naming tensions within the system. But there are many ways to externalize the problem so that people can see it together and share their own experience of it. Other ways I do include things like constellations or estuarine mapping, many ways to do mapping and representation. Let me give you an example, because I know that was an awful lot. So I've got here 2 organizations, same method, right? The first one is Pepco. It's a South African retailer. The second one is also South African. It's a restaurant franchise called Spur. First one's a very large organization, 50,000 people. The other one has about 5,000 people. So the linear steps are gone. I warned you about that. But they're all going to be here. They're going to weave their way through this. Sometimes all I have is 2 hours. That's, we don't have a few days to go off on retreat. This is a task that needs to be done. We fit in with what they need to do. So Pepco needed to do a disclosure exercise to identify climate risk to enable their reporting to the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. Okay, this is not ritual stuff, right? This is kind of disclosure, and it's usually what they will do, they'll pay a lot of money to get a climate scientist to model this for them. Problem, it stays in a very complicated model. No one is any the wiser on the ground. And all the embodied knowledge of the people often is overlooked, right? So it's like, let's not do it like that. Let's stretch the boundary on what's possible in terms of TCFD disclosure. So I threw in 3 fault lines. One of them, for example, speed versus slack. We're working now with a supply chain and particularly the logistics team of Pepco Group. And if I throw in a pattern, a fault line, speed versus slack, what I'm talking about here is the faster your system runs, the faster you're bringing in textiles from India and China, right, to South Africa to make school uniforms for kids. Right? This is what they're doing, actually. They make 2 million school uniforms a year. The faster the system runs, the less the buffer exists when something breaks. This is a complex thing, a supply chain between India and China and South Africa. We want to get the school uniforms made in a way that is affordable. Now there are trade-offs here. It would be lovely if we have a textile industry in South Africa, and it would be lovely if it hadn't been destroyed, but it has. So now we're in a situation of needing to address something that is not perfect, but nonetheless we want to improve, right? If they need to do this with lower carbon, if they need to do this in ways that take account of climate risk, it's going to be difficult and it's going to play into that fault line. And I just name it because they haven't had time to even think about it. They're still busy trying to bring material across the sea. And what happens when we name it? They'll start telling you stories of their operation experience that they don't get time to share anywhere else. Yes, they'll say, yes, you know what? And we had just brought that in. And then we had a pirate issue on Somalia. We had to kind of change the supply route, or we can't afford the fuel anymore because of the environmental emissions criteria. So now this becomes interesting from a risk point of view. What shifted was people felt their knowledge mattered because we gathered that information. And I was there as part of it, not as the facilitator in many respects. And here was what happened for me. I was the person who thought this would, generate some nice outcome in terms of TCFD, and it did. But this took me completely by surprise. It was what happened when they said, this is a great process. We want to do more of this. I nearly fell over backwards because this is a very, very busy supply chain team. They had ownership and they wanted to do more. And that was a beautiful, unexpected outcome. And that was what told me that this method actually worked. And something very similar happened with Spur. They were doing a purpose-led strategy around the greater good. An example of one of the fault lines we dropped in was ESG, environmental, social, and governance compliance versus inclusion. That's a fault line. And the reason is ESG often costs more. You've got to meet standards you didn't have to before. And what that means is if you're a Black franchisee, you've got a Black owner of a small franchise, they often got that franchise in a very difficult way, and they don't have any spare cash to spend on anything more, like recycled materials or recyclable this or that, So often the costs fall harder on those who are disadvantaged by history, and in this case, obviously, Black South Africans. And so we're balancing a fault line again. The fault line is not the fault of anyone. The fault line is in the broader systemic underlying structural reality. By making it explicit, we start hearing people's stories. And the stories that came out in this case were absolutely amazing. Again, people felt that experience was respected and that there was a sense of ownership, warmth, and appetite, the same unexpected outcome. And that moved us into this realization that, while we can even use AI to generate these fault lines, it involves rapid synthesis really, because this is all the same. You can come up with the same fault lines for the same subsector or sector or subsector. If you're running a supply chain, the fault lines are going to be the same, but the fault lines are not the intelligence. AI will generate it for you, but the stories carry the intelligence. The stories are embodied. The stories are relational. The stories are local. And the outcomes, these unexpected outcomes, are not soft. They're actually the condition for what follows, for everything else. So that was really how I was able to find a way to do divination in organizations very easily fitting in. Putting the power in many respects back into the hands of the people who enact the risk management in this case. Okay, that was a very long, sorry, I did get a bit carried away. So shall we stop for a few questions, Constantine? Or you can just do a quick embodied practice. I mean, I don't know where we are here. I wanted to end a bit.
Time-wise, we have about 12 minutes. There were some questions. Barbara asked, how do you invite in or give permission for intuition? Which is a great question. And then Anand mentioned the conflict between efficiency and effectiveness. And then Sunil is raising his hand. But we also have the embodied practice. So I don't know, you can ask the audience what they want to do.
Okay.
Or maybe you can do a short version of it.
Let's do that. Let me talk to those questions. So now they're in the room. So how do I invite in intuition? I don't actually. It's always there. So I trust that people tell stories from intuition. I don't have to invite it. That's a very short answer. I find if I start inviting things and giving permission, I'm too much the one in authority. I just trust that people will come up with it. And they always do. They always surprise me. And so again, in a similar way, I don't hold the space. The task holds the space. I'm part of the space. And making that shift felt very important to me. It allowed me to drop the expert, right? The expert who's there, as the one who knows, as the one who invites, as the one who evokes. No, the patterns do that for me, the little patterns, and that generally can be generated by AI. I try and keep myself out of the space. Yeah, I don't know if that was a bit of an answer. What was the second question? Sorry.
Anand, yeah, do you want to ask?
Yeah, in the meetings, there's a lot of emphasis on efficiency, time is short, and the process that you talked about obviously will take its time. How do you balance these conflicting goals of efficiency and effectiveness? of the meeting?
Look, it's a great question. And efficiency versus effectiveness, or I could say efficiency versus resilience, is the classic trade-off in organizations. And it will happen also, again, in a fractal way. It will happen in a process such as this. So I know I can do this process in 2 hours, which is generally the kind of time I'm able to ask for from a busy team. I don't have the credibility of somebody who can say, oh, we need to go off site for 2 days and we can do, all these embodied practices. So I needed to make this very, very effective in a short time period.
Nicola, sorry to stop in so Jyoti says, can we please do the embodied practice?
Yes,
Okay.
We can only do that here, and questions we can ask by email.
We'll not have second time with Nicola.
No, I tell you what, you can send me questions. I will answer them. I will absolutely.
I'll put Nicola's email in the chat, and you can contact her, please.
All right, good. All right, well, let's start the embodied practice. And I will stay on as well after if we need to. This is about preparation. This is about based on how diviners prepare for divination ritual. And this is going to be individual. This is to prepare us to engage in embodied space. So I'm going to kind of shut that off. You're welcome to close your eyes if you like. Please sit in a way that's comfortable, feeling grounded. Both feet on the floor, if you can do that. And I'd like to ask you to allow your attention to settle. Just how that arrives for you. Just being in your space, feeling your space with you. And then allowing your breath to slow a little. And when you're ready, I'd like you to invite your mother and your father to stand behind you. Your father on the right, your mother on the left. Just however you hold them, mother and father. They may be living, they may be not. Your relationship with them may be simple, it may be complicated, it's okay. Just their presence behind you. And when they're behind you, I want you to invite behind them your 4 grandparents. And on the right will be your grandfathers. On the left will be your grandmothers. And now behind them, invite 8 great-grandparents. Yeah. 16 great-great-grandparents. And behind them, 32, 64, 128, 256. You've got grandmothers and grandfathers in a line, deepening, the line widening, the line going back and back. It's going back through generations that you will never know by name. The generations are reaching through histories that you can only sense. And they go all the way back to the very first ones, the very first ancestor, to the source. All the way back to the beginning of time. And in Ngoma, you've reached Umoya, the breath of life. Umoya, the breath of life. So rest here for a moment. That's where your ancestral line goes back. And now I want you, from that place of origin, from the very first ancestor, place their hands on the shoulders of those in front of them. And then they will place their hands on the shoulders in front of the next, and the next, and the next, and all the way forward, down the line, until your mother and your father place their hands on your shoulders. Your father's hand on your right, your mother's hand on the left. And I want you to notice what happens, whatever happens. And breathe. Breathe that breath of life. And then gently bow your head a little in gratitude. And slowly, with that feeling of gratitude, allow the line to return back to its place, back to their places, back to where they came. Back to the sky, back to the earth, back to the sea. And you also gently return back to our space together. And that is called an ancestral line. An ancestral line is reminding us that we are so many in our bodies, in our beings, in our decisions, in our actions. And the question I might leave with you based on that is, where was the threshold for you? Where was the threshold for you? Okay, that was a quick practice, but it can be quick, and hopefully it was possible in that short time. Anand.
It was for me, certainly. And Jyoti, thank you for insisting, even in a short time, it's possible. And my parents are still alive, but I hardly see them because they live at the other end of the world, where I live at the other end of the world. And yeah, I hardly see them. So that was a way to experience them and appreciate them. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
With
Beautiful.
this, I thank all the participants. I think especially Nicola Robbins for
Grateful.
a very excellent presentation. Everybody wants more. So this is an invitation also to stay connected. We will have a feedback sheet at the end of the whole colloquium, where you can also opt into a WhatsApp group, which is an informal way of staying connected. That's free to anyone. And Nicola, of course, I've shared her contact details. She is happy to receive your questions. And I know she will be here for the next session, which
Sure.
is our plenary 2 with Janara Goreng, Chukurpa Pulka, Sacred and Visionary Leadership in First Peoples in Australia, which will be followed by a presentation from Ekaterina Churovleva Todarello on the researcher's inner journey, self and graced knowing, and then Dreams and the Alchemy of Transformation by Melinda Powell. And then How Can You Write About All of This? Publishing in MSR, which is a session that I will hold. So with that, thank you very much, everyone, for your participation.